Hey everyone, this is Making Mulligan Stew, and in this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to saddle stitch leather as well as the several different options along the way. We'll go through the equipment, supplies, and processes necessary to get consistent, even, and appealing stitching. So let's get started. When it comes to stitching leather, there's several different shapes and several different thicknesses of needles you can actually choose from. But for a majority of the leather work, I think you get away with just these two. So at the very top you have the Tandy standard thickness saddling needle. This one's usually paired with thicker threads which require a larger hole. While on the bottom, the John James 004 saddling needle, this one's usually paired with thinner threads which require a smaller hole. Creating the stitching hole spacing can be done by using a stitching wheel, a ruler and awl, or my preferred method of using a diamond stitching iron. A diamond stitching iron contains a point that actually turns into a diamond. So when you punch that diamond shape into the leather, you will have the front stitch and the back stitch to rest at the opposite ends of the corner, creating a nice, clean, and uniform stitch. When dealing with stitching irons too, it's also important to consider the pitch. Pitch is the distance between each point on the stitching iron. This is important because this will determine the overall look of your stitching. So for instance, I have a 4mm, a 3mm, and a 2.5mm. The 4mm tends to be used with thicker threads, while the 3 and the 2.5 tends to be used with the thinner threads. This is important because this also determines the spacing. Thicker threads with smaller pitches would look too busy, while having thinner threads and larger pitches, the stitching wouldn't look busy enough, almost looking empty. For thread, there's really three major factors when determining what type of thread will suit your needs. First, is it braided? Braided thread is multiple pieces of thread intertwined or braided together to create a stronger and longer lasting thread. Two, is it waxed? Wax gives the thread some water resistance, along with helping prevent any fraying with the use of the leather product. And three, thickness or diameter. This determines the final overall look of your product. A thicker thread will give your product a more rugged look. Thicker threads also tend to hide mistakes more in the stitching, while thinner threads will give your product a more refined, finer quality look. But note with thinner threads, mistakes are more noticeable. These next tools are optional, but definitely useful for getting the job done. Here I have an X-Acto knife. This is great for cutting the leather, especially around any kind of contours or odd shapes you may have. Just some kind of cutting utensil to help me cut the threads. Here I have a compass, and a compass is a great tool because you're able to change the distance between these 2 points, which is useful for scribing a line some distance along the edge for consistent stitching. Have a ruler and an awl, and you can use the ruler some distance from the edge and use the awl to scribe a straight line for stitching or any kind of marking if you don't have a compass. Here's a diamond awl, same concept as the diamond stitching irons. This is used for creating a diamond shaped punch into the leather, but a smaller punch than the stitching irons. And lastly, got the edge beveler. This is useful because this creates a nice finished look to the edges of the leather. When it comes to deciding how far from the edge to place your stitching line, I like to match the distance with the pitch of the stitching irons I'll be using. For this instance, I'll be using the 3mm stitching irons, so I match the points on the compass with 2 adjacent points on the stitching iron. Here illustrates visually the different stitching line distances, paired with the same edge bevel in number 2. To use the compass, run one point along the edge of the leather while scribing the surface of the leather with the other point. If you don't have a compass, mark your distance from the edge on the leather and create the straight line using a ruler and awl. There are several options for creating stitching holes, but to keep it simple, I'll stick to the two options using the diamond shape. Just remember, when using the stitching irons on the leather, make sure to use a rubber, not metal, mallet. Most importantly, for either method, always keep your project and your stitching irons perpendicular to each other when punching or marking. This will ensure an even and consistent appearance to the stitching on both the front and back side of the project. Option 1, punching all the way through the leather. This method tends to leave a larger hole, which is great for thicker threads and is a lot quicker than option 2. To get even spacing with stitching irons, once the first punches are made, place the blade at one end into an existing punch and continue punching. Option 2, using the stitching irons to imprint the location of the holes, then coming back and punching the marked locations with the diamond awl. This method does take a little bit more time, but when using the finer or thinner threads, it produces a finer quality result. For this tutorial, to illustrate the difference between punching through and marking, then punching, half of this leather will be one, the other half will be the other. When determining the thread length, it's important to have enough thread because the last thing you want is to run out of thread at the tail end and have to redo all the stitching. That's why I believe it's best to have at least 6 times the length of thread for the area being stitched. With thicker leather, or a thicker stack up of leather, it's best to bump that number up. It's better to waste a little bit of thread at the end than potentially wasting more and having to redo the stitching because there wasn't enough thread to complete. For this L shape in the upper corner, I'll be using the thicker 1mm brown thread, and for this L shape in the lower corner, I'll be using the thinner 0.6mm white thread. This way we'll have a visual representation of how thread thickness can affect the product's final look. To measure the amount of thread needed, first start where the stitching will begin and run the thread along the areas that will be stitched in that section. Repeat this step however many times necessary. For this, I'll repeat this step for a total of 6 times for each thread. To lock the thread into the needle, first take the thread and place one end through the eye of the needle. Pull some slack on the thread and pierce the thread in the middle with the needle, leaving some slack on the end. Pull the thread towards the eye and through the top, locking the thread into the needle. Repeat this step with the other end of the thread so that both ends have needles locked in. Here it is again with the thicker thread. Some holes may be a little bit more troublesome, so I like to use the diamond awl to help open those holes up. I tend to use the awl on each hole beforehand to help move things along. Using the awl with the backside on something like this mat will help prevent any wrinkles around the stitching hole. Now we have everything we need to finally start stitching. To start the stitch, I start by inserting one needle at one end and pull the needle with the thread through and up. Now pull both needles up together to give each side equal lengths of thread. For reference, this side will be my back and this side will be my front. I like to work back to front, then front to back. Start by placing the back needle through the next stitch, pull tight and back towards the first stitch. With tension still on that first thread, place the front needle over and forward that first thread. Pull both threads tight enough for tension and repeat. The most important thing to remember with stitching, no matter what the method, stay consistent. Changing the order, pattern, or method midway through your stitching will create a messy and inconsistent look. Coming towards the end, we'll want to backstitch at least 2 stitches to help lock in the stitching. It's important to follow the same technique that was used throughout the stitching, but now in the other direction. There's really two options to finish off the thread. The first option is to place the thread in between the layers of leather and tying and cutting off the thread, which will hide in between. The option I use is having both ends of the thread on one side, usually the back side, and cutting the thread. Once you have your thread cut, finish off the ends by burning them. This will help prevent the ends from fraying. There's a few different variations or methods when it comes to stitching. Personally, I've never noticed a difference in the few methods I've used because the technique of 2-needle saddle stitching is so robust that any variation will create a durable, long-lasting stitch. Here's a look at the finished stitching line. It's straight, clean, and consistent. If you found something of value out of this tutorial, please make sure to hit the like button. And if you'd like to see videos like this in the future, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching.